The first sign of trouble wasn't the torrential downpour hammering against my basement windows like a legion of tiny, angry drummers. No, in this part of the country, a good old-fashioned frog strangler of a storm is practically a seasonal amenity. My house, a monument to my own particular brand of engineering genius, was designed to withstand far worse. The real harbinger of doom, the canary in my subterranean coal mine, was the silence. It was a profound, unnatural quiet that slowly seeped into my consciousness, cutting through the glorious 7.1 surround sound of my custom-built home theater. I was halfway through a meticulously curated Explosions in Space movie marathon, and the Millennium Falcon was doing its level best to escape a particularly nasty asteroid field. The subwoofers, each the size of a small corgi, were supposed to be rattling my dental fillings. Instead, there was nothing. A dull, lifeless thud, where a soul-shaking kaboom should have been. I paused the movie. The silence deepened, broken only by the frantic drumming of the rain. And another sound. A soft, insidious lapping. My blood ran cold. I glanced down. A shimmering sheet of water was spreading across the polished concrete floor of my sanctuary. It was already covering my feet, a cold, unwelcome kiss from the underworld. This wasn't just a leak. This was an invasion. My eyes darted to the custom control panel on the wall. A beautiful Frankenstein's monster of touchscreens and toggle switches that monitored every system in my house. The sump pump indicator, usually a steady, reassuring green, was a glaring, angry red. "System offline!" it screamed in all caps, as if to mock my hubris. "Impossible," I muttered, my voice a hollow echo in the suddenly cavernous space. My sump pump system wasn't just a system, it was a trinity. 3 independent, heavy-duty pumps, each with its own power supply and a backup battery that could keep them running through a biblical apocalypse. For all 3 to fail simultaneously was statistically improbable to the point of being an act of God. Or, as I was about to discover, an act of Carol. I waded through the rising water, my expensive Japanese selvage denim soaking up the murky tide with alarming speed. The pumps were housed in a small, well-lit closet at the far end of the basement. I yanked open the door, expecting to be greeted by the familiar, reassuring hum of machinery. Instead, silence. The circuit breakers on the dedicated panel were all flipped to the off position. Not tripped, flipped deliberately. And tied to the main breaker switch with a hot pink zip tie was a small, laminated note. The laminate, I noted with a detached sense of clinical fury, was a nice touch. Professional. Waterproof. It read, in a prim, passive-aggressive font that could only belong to one person on this planet: unauthorized electrical modification. A violation of HOA bylaws, Section 7, Subsection B. Please consult the approved vendor list for any and all future home improvements. A fine will be issued. Sincerely, Carol, HOA President. Carol. The name hung in the air like the smell of burning sulfur. Carol, the self-appointed guardian of suburban mediocrity. Carol, who had once tried to fine me for having a welcome mat that she deemed excessively welcoming. Carol, who had measured the height of my grass with a ruler and sent me a certified letter when it exceeded the mandated 2.5 inches. She had doomed me. She had signed the death warrant for my home theater, my workshop, my collection of vintage arcade machines that were currently standing in 3 inches of rapidly rising water. The water was now lapping at the base of my mint-condition Galaga cabinet. It was personal. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me, so potent it almost pushed back the floodwaters. I scrambled back through the basement, my mind racing. I could call the cops. I could call a lawyer. I could try to reason with the screaming banshee who lived across the street. But all of that took time. Time I didn't have. The water was already past my ankles, a cold, relentless tide of Carol-scented despair. I splashed my way up the stairs and burst into the garage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The main breaker box for the entire house was on the outside wall, right next to the garage door. I fumbled with the latch, my wet hand slipping on the metal. It wouldn't budge. Of course it wouldn't. Through the small glass window on the box's cover, I could see it. A padlock. A bright pink, comically oversized padlock. It was a declaration of war. For a moment, I just stood there, the rain plastering my hair to my forehead, the sheer, unmitigated audacity of it all threatening to send me into a state of catatonic shock. She had padlocked my power. My power. The lifeblood of my existence. And then something inside me snapped. It wasn't a quiet snap, like a twig underfoot. It was a loud, resounding crack, like a sequoia tree splitting in a lightning storm. A primal scream of defiance erupted from my lungs, a sound that was probably a violation of several noise ordinances in its own right. I was done playing by the rules. I was done being a victim of the beige tyranny of the HOA. My eyes scanned the garage, a chaotic wonderland of half-finished projects and glorious, over-engineered solutions to problems that didn't exist. And then, I saw it. Tucked away in the corner, covered by a dusty tarp, was my magnum opus. My white whale, my ark, the portable substation fleet. It was a thing of beauty, a monument to my particular brand of glorious, unnecessary excess. A series of interconnected military-grade generators, each capable of powering a small village, all mounted on heavy-duty casters. I'd built it for a planned expedition to the Black Rock Desert, an off-grid extravaganza that had been indefinitely postponed due to a series of increasingly elaborate and ultimately insurmountable logistical hurdles. It was, by any rational measure, the most ridiculously overpowered generator system ever conceived by man. It was perfect. A slow, maniacal grin spread across my face, the kind of grin that usually precedes a very loud explosion or a very questionable life choice. Carol wanted to play hardball? Fine. I was about to bring a tactical nuclear weapon to a knife fight. The next 4 minutes were a blur of adrenaline-fueled, waterlogged fury. I tore the tarp off the substation fleet with a theatrical flourish, revealing its rugged, olive-drab glory. They looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic action movie, and I felt like the grizzled, lantern-jawed hero about to save the day. With a series of grunts and splashes, I began to roll them out into the driveway, one by one. They were heavy, cumbersome, and utterly magnificent. The rain was coming down in sheets now, but I barely noticed. I was a man on a mission, a warrior possessed by the Holy Spirit of Nikola Tesla himself. The neighbors, no doubt alerted by my primal scream, were starting to peek from behind their curtains. I could feel their judgmental eyes on me, but I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them bear witness to the glorious rebirth of Leo, the man who would not be drowned. I uncoiled the cables, each one as thick as a boa constrictor and just as powerful. These weren't your garden variety extension cords. These were industrial-grade, heavy-duty lifelines, capable of carrying enough electricity to reanimate a dinosaur. With a series of satisfyingly loud and definitive thunks, I bypassed Carol's pathetic little padlock and the entire compromised electrical grid, plugging my house directly into the heart of my mechanical beast. I took a deep breath, wiped the rain from my eyes, and stood before the master control panel of the substation. This was it, the moment of truth. With a silent prayer to the gods of torque, horsepower, and righteous indignation, I flipped the master switch. The result was nothing short of biblical. The generators roared to life in unison, a deafening, soul-stirring symphony of internal combustion that shook the very foundations of the neighborhood. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The air crackled with raw, untamed power. The lights in my house, which had been dark and lifeless moments before, flickered once, twice, and then blazed to life, a brilliant, defiant beacon in the stormy darkness. My house was a supernova in a galaxy of beige, and then, from the depths of the basement, came the sweetest sound I had ever heard, the deep, guttural roar of my triple redundant sump pumps, waking from their enforced slumber and beginning to drink, greedily, from the floodwaters that had threatened to consume my world. It was the sound of victory. I stood there in my driveway, soaked to the bone, rain and sweat mingling on my face in a triumphant cocktail of exhaustion and exhilaration. I was a conductor, a maestro, and this was my masterpiece. I had cheated death, or at least a very expensive and emotionally devastating insurance claim. I had stared into the abyss of a flooded basement and spat in its watery, carol-infested eye. I was, for a fleeting, glorious moment, the king of the world, the master of my own electrical destiny. My moment of triumph was short-lived, however, rudely interrupted by a new sound that cut through the glorious roar of my generators like a rusty chainsaw through a silk pillow. It was a high-pitched, piercing shriek, a sound that could curdle milk at 50 paces. "Leo! Leo! What is the meaning of this?" I turned, a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying smile spreading across my face. There she was, Carol, in all her rain-soaked, pajama-clad, miniature dog-clutching glory. She was standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, contorted into a silent scream that was barely audible over the din of my mechanical saviors. Her tiny, yapping dog, a creature that seemed to be composed entirely of nervous energy and raw fury, mirrored her sentiment, its tiny body trembling with impotent rage. The battle for the basement was over. The war for the neighborhood had just begun. My smile widened into a grin that felt both predatory and deeply liberating. "Just providing a little temporary power, Carol," I yelled, my voice hoarse with adrenaline. "Wouldn't want my priceless collection of vintage pinball machines to get water damaged, now would we? HOA bylaws, you know. Section 12, subsection C, duty to mitigate damages." I had no idea if that was a real bylaw, but it sounded official enough. Her face, already flushed with anger, cycled through several shades of red before settling on a rather alarming shade of puce. She looked like a cartoon character who had just swallowed a lit stick of dynamite. You have violated every noise ordinance in the city, in the state, possibly in the entire country. I'm calling the police." "You do that, Carol," I bellowed back, my voice dripping with newfound confidence. "You do that!" I gave her a jaunty little salute, a gesture of pure, unadulterated defiance. Then, I turned my back on her and her yapping rat dog and strode back into my brightly lit house, the roar of my generators a sweet, sweet lullaby of power and victory. The police were coming. Let them come. I had a PowerPoint presentation to prepare. The arrival of the boys in blue was, in a word, cinematic. The flashing red and blue lights of their cruiser painted surreal, strobing patterns across the rain-slicked street and the horrified faces of my neighbors. 2 officers emerged, a study in contrasts. The driver was a young, eager-looking kid with a fresh-faced, by-the-book intensity. His name tag read Davis. His partner was the polar opposite. A seasoned, world-weary veteran, with a mustache that had probably seen more action than most rookie cops, and a look in his eyes that suggested he'd long ago made peace with the fundamental absurdity of human existence. His name tag read Miller. They were not, it is safe to say, prepared for the scene that greeted them. My house, a blazing beacon of incandescent defiance in the stormy night, humming with the raw, untamed power of a small-scale industrial power plant, the generators roaring like a squadron of jet fighters preparing for takeoff, and Carol, a screaming, pajama-clad harpy, flapping her arms in a desperate attempt to convey the sheer, unmitigated magnitude of my transgressions against God and the HOA. "He's a menace!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me as if I were a B-movie monster emerging from a radioactive swamp. "A public nuisance! He's trying to deafen the entire neighborhood! He's generating!" I, on the other hand, had used the few precious minutes it had taken for them to arrive to transform myself into the very picture of calm, collected, and slightly damp reason. I met them at the end of my driveway, holding a waterproof tablet that was already queued up to a slick, professionally designed PowerPoint presentation entitled The Great Flood of 2025, a case study in proactive emergency mitigation. "Officers," I began, my voice a soothing balm of rationality against Carol's hurricane of hysteria. "Thank you for your prompt response. I believe I can shed some light on this situation." Officer Davis, the rookie, immediately puffed out his chest and got down to business. He had his notepad out and was dutifully scribbling down every noise ordinance I was currently shattering into a million pieces. "Sir, are you aware that you are in violation of Municipal Code 14-7 regarding excessive noise levels after 10 p.m.? But Miller, the veteran, was a different story. He ignored Davis, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced, almost bored eye. He looked at the roaring generators, the thick black cables snaking across my lawn, the brightly lit house, and then at Carol, who was now hyperventilating into a paper bag she'd produced from the pocket of her silk robe. He had a look on his face that I'd seen on a lot of old cops, a look that said, "I've seen it all, but this is a new one." He was trying, and failing, to maintain a professional demeanor. I could see the corners of his mouth twitching, a battle being waged between duty and amusement. He listened patiently to Carol's tirade, which included accusations of electrical terrorism and acoustic warfare. Then, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "All right, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let's see your little show." I swiped to the first slide. As you can see from this topographical map of the neighborhood, my property is located at the lowest point of a natural drainage basin. I walked them through the situation, step by logical, evidence-based step. The flash flood warning issued by the National Weather Service. The failure of my primary sump pump system. I presented Exhibit A, a high-resolution photograph of the laminated note, its pink zip tie a tiny, damning detail. I presented Exhibit B, a close-up of the bright pink, comically oversized padlock on my main breaker box. Davis, to his credit, stopped writing and started listening. Miller just stroked his mustache, a slow, thoughtful gesture. When I got to the slide showing the real-time data from my basement's water level sensors, a terrifyingly steep upward curve that abruptly plateaued and then began to decline at the precise moment the generators were activated, he let out a low whistle. He walked over to Carol, who had momentarily paused her hysterics to watch my presentation with a look of slack-jawed disbelief. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "While Mr.?" He glanced at my tablet, which I had helpfully left on the About the Presenter slide. "Leo's solution is unconventional. I'm more concerned about the fact that you deliberately cut off his power during a flash flood. Tampering with utility equipment is a serious offense, and given the circumstances, he gestured towards my still damp basement, this could easily be construed as reckless endangerment. Carol's jaw dropped. She sputtered. She stammered. But for the first time that night, she was speechless. The word reckless endangerment seemed to have finally penetrated her thick skull. Miller turned back to me. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. "Son," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little impressed. But you gotta do something about the noise. We're getting calls from 3 counties over. People think the airport's under attack." He then advised us both, in a tone that was less of a suggestion and more of a command, to seek legal counsel. It was a classic cop move, a way of washing his hands of a situation that was rapidly spiraling into a vortex of suburban absurdity. The cops departed, leaving Carol and me standing in our respective driveways, the roar of the generators a triumphant soundtrack to my victory. The battle lines were drawn. The war was far from over. But for the first time, I felt like I had a fighting chance. The immediate threat had been neutralized. My basement was slowly but surely draining. My pinball machines were safe, and Carol had been temporarily silenced by the terrifying prospect of actual legal consequences. But I knew this was just a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Carol was a creature of pure, unadulterated spite. She would be back, armed with more bylaws, more laminated notes, and an entire army of petty tyrants from the HOA. I needed a permanent solution, a solution that would take the power, quite literally, out of her hands. I needed to sever my connection to the HOA-controlled grid entirely. I needed my own independent power line, a direct artery of pure, unadulterated electricity, free from the grasping tentacles of Carol and her beige-colored cabal. There was only one man in town for a job this audacious, this gloriously insane. A man who viewed building codes as mere suggestions and HOAs as a personal affront to the American dream. A man known in certain, less reputable circles as Crazy Pete. I found his number on a crumpled, grease-stained business card I'd kept pinned to the corkboard in my garage for just such an apocalyptic occasion. The card was simple, direct, and slightly threatening. Pete's Trenching and Light Demolition. You got a problem? We can dig it, bury it, or knock it down. I had a feeling when he'd handed it to me after a brief but memorable argument with a building inspector over the structural integrity of my deck, that our paths were destined to cross again. He answered on the second ring, his voice a low, gravelly growl that sounded like it had been aged in a barrel of whiskey and rusty nails. "Pete's! What'd you break?" I took a deep breath and launched into the saga. The flood, the pumps, the laminated note, the pink padlock, the generators, the cops, and of course, Carol. With each detail I recounted, I could hear a low rumbling on the other end of the line, a sound that I slowly realized was a deep, guttural chuckle. "An HOA Karen, you say?" he said, the chuckle erupting into a full-blown, belly-shaking laugh. "Padlocked your breaker box during a flood? Son, that ain't just a Karen. That's a final boss." He paused, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. "I've been waiting for a job like this my whole life." He was at my house within the hour, his battered pickup truck, a machine that looked like it had survived multiple direct meteor impacts, rumbling to a stop in my driveway. Crazy Pete was a sight to behold. A grizzly bear of a man, with a wild, untamed beard that seemed to have a life of its own, a wilder look in his eye, and a belly that strained against the confines of his grease-stained overalls. He looked less like a contractor and more like a Viking who had taken a wrong turn at Greenland. He took one look at my generator setup, at the roaring engines and the thick, black cables snaking across my lawn, and his face broke into a massive, gap-toothed grin. He walked over, slapped one of the generators as if it were a prize-winning hog at a county fair, and nodded in appreciation. "Son," he said, clapping me on the back with a hand the size of a small ham, a blow that nearly sent me face first into my own meticulously manicured flower bed. "I like your style. Noisy, inefficient, obnoxious. It's beautiful." We stood there for a long moment, two kindred spirits, a pair of slightly unhinged visionaries united in our shared disdain for petty tyranny and sensible, understated solutions. We were more than just a client and a contractor. We were brothers in arms, comrades in the great, ongoing war against the forces of beige. "So," he said, rubbing his hands together with a conspiratorial glee, "let's talk about this trench. You want to run a new line from the main utility pole, bypass the HOA's grid completely. I can do that in my sleep, but—" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're not just going to dig a trench, are we? That's what they want us to do. No, we're going to make a statement." His eyes gleamed with a mischievous, almost maniacal light. "We're going to build a monument," he declared, his voice filled with the passion of a revolutionary. "A monument to freedom, to liberty, and to the inalienable right to have a sump pump that actually, pumps." And so the plan was hatched. A plan so audacious, so beautifully, gloriously insane, that it just might work. We weren't just going to trench a new power line. We were going to encase the new, independent power pedestal in a statue. A 10-foot-tall, solid concrete statue of a hand, its middle finger raised in a proud, defiant salute, aimed directly, and with extreme prejudice, at Carol's perfectly manicured, by-law-abiding house. It was a Declaration of Independence, written in rebar and concrete, and it was going to be magnificent. The next morning, my front yard, the pride of my suburban existence, became a war zone. At the crack of dawn, Pete and his crew, a motley assortment of grizzled, tattooed men who all looked like they'd just been honorably discharged from a biker gang, descended upon my property with a small arsenal of heavy machinery. The star of the show was the trencher, a monstrous, snarling beast of a machine that looked like a giant, mechanical mole, with a serious anger management problem. It tore into my pristine, HOA-approved lawn with a savage glee, leaving a deep, muddy scar in its wake, a symbol of my liberation from the tyranny of perfectly manicured grass. The noise was apocalyptic, a symphony of roaring engines, grinding gears, and the occasional shouted curse that would have made a sailor blush. The sight was even more so. My once peaceful suburban paradise was now a scene of glorious, chaotic destruction, and I loved every single beautiful second of it. The neighbors, of course, were a different story. They began to emerge from their houses, drawn by the beautiful music of my rebellion, their faces a mixture of horror, fascination, and, in a few brave and beautiful cases, undisguised glee. Carol, naturally, was leading the charge of the horrified. She was on her front porch, dressed in a sensible pantsuit, her phone glued to her ear. I could only assume she was on a one-woman crusade to contact every city official, county commissioner, and federal agency in the continental United States. She was a woman on a mission, a warrior for the cause of beige, soulless conformity. And she was not going down without a fight. But for every Carol, there was a secret supporter, a dissident in the suburban gulag, a neighbor who'd had their own run-in with the HOA's iron fist, a disgruntled homeowner who'd been cited for having the wrong shade of white on their trim, or for flying a flag that was deemed unseasonably patriotic. A small but determined resistance movement began to form. People would wander over, feigning curiosity about the construction, and then, in hushed, conspiratorial tones, offer their support. "Give her hell, Leo," muttered my next-door neighbor, a quiet accountant named Bob, who had once been fined for having a structurally ambiguous garden gnome. He pressed a six-pack of craft beer into my hands. "We're all counting on you." Another neighbor, a sweet old lady named Mrs. Gable, brought over a plate of still-warm chocolate chip cookies. "Carol made me dig up my prize-winning petunias because they were non-native," she whispered, a steely glint in her eye. "It's about time someone stood up to her." They brought us coffee and donuts. They brought us beer and sandwiches. They brought us stories of their own battles with the HOA, each one a testament to the petty tyranny that had ruled our neighborhood for far too long. My front yard was no longer just a construction site. It was the headquarters of a revolution. Carol, however, was not one to be deterred by a little thing like public opinion or a populist uprising. She was a force of nature, a hurricane of bureaucratic rage. She called the city's code enforcement department, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. But Pete, my glorious, bearded savant of a contractor, was one step ahead of her. He had not only pulled all the necessary permits, he'd also unearthed a loophole in a little-known dust-covered zoning ordinance from 1973 that allowed for the construction of freestanding ornamental yard art up to 12 feet in height. She called the Environmental Protection Agency, screeching about soil erosion and the disturbance of a fragile ecosystem of rare, indigenous lawn slugs. Pete, a man of many hidden talents, calmly produced a notarized document from a certified amateur malacologist, his cousin, who owned a snail farm, stating that my yard was, in fact, free of any endangered gastropods. In a moment of sheer unadulterated desperation, she even called the fire department, claiming that our muddy, water-logged trench posed a significant and immediate fire hazard. The fire chief, a large, jolly man with a magnificent mustache that rivaled Miller's, took one look at our swampy, mud-filled ditch and declared it to be the least flammable thing he'd ever seen. He then asked if he could take a picture with the trencher. With each failed attempt to stop us, Carol grew more and more unhinged. Her screams grew louder, her threats more outlandish. She was a woman on the verge of a complete and total suburban meltdown. And we were there for it, shovels in hand, a symphony of defiance in our hearts, our work fueled by coffee, cookies, and the sweet, sweet tears of a defeated Karen. The trench was dug, the heavily armored conduit was laid, the concrete, tons of it, was poured, and then the pièce de résistance, the statue, a 10-foot-tall monument to freedom, a middle finger to the forces of conformity, shrouded in a giant blue tarp like a sacred relic, waiting for its moment of glory. The day of the unveiling was a spectacle to behold. It had taken on the air of a major cultural event. The entire neighborhood had gathered on my lawn, a sea of curious, expectant faces, their phones held aloft, ready to capture the historic moment. The pro-Carol faction, a small but vocal minority of HOA loyalists, stood huddled together on one side, their arms crossed, their faces grim and disapproving. The anti-Carol resistance, a much larger and more enthusiastic crowd, stood on the other, their faces alight with the giddy anticipation of a public execution. I, in my self-appointed role as the master of ceremonies and revolutionary leader, stood on a makeshift stage, a stack of plywood on 2 sawhorses, a microphone in my hand. I had prepared a speech for the ages, a soaring oration on the virtues of freedom, the importance of property rights, and the indomitable spirit of the American homeowner who just wants to be left alone to enjoy his ridiculously overpowered home theater. It was, if I do say so myself, a masterpiece of suburban rhetoric, equal parts Thomas Paine and Weird Al Yankovic. "Friends, neighbors, fellow prisoners of the beige," I began. my voice booming through a portable PA system Pete had borrowed from a local high school football field. For too long, we have lived under the yoke of tyranny, a tyranny of arbitrary rules and laminated notes, a tyranny of approved color palettes and mandated lawn heights. But today, we cast off those shackles. Today, we declare our independence. Today, we send a message that will be seen, a message that will be heard, a message, I paused for dramatic effect, that is written in solid, reinforced concrete. And then, the moment of truth. With a dramatic flourish that would have made P.T. Barnum proud, Pete and his crew pulled on the ropes, and the giant blue tarp fell away, revealing our creation in all its glorious, unadulterated splendor. The reaction was immediate and visceral. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The pro-Carol faction recoiled in horror, their faces a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. The anti-Carol resistance erupted in a roar of cheers and applause, a sound of pure, cathartic joy. And Carol fainted. Just straight up fainted. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her knees buckled, and she collapsed in a heap on her perfectly manicured lawn, her tiny, yapping dog yapping even more furiously at the sight of its fallen master, as if trying to bark her back to consciousness. The police were called, of course. It wouldn't have been a proper neighborhood event without an appearance by our favorite men in blue. This time, it was Miller and Davis again, drawn to my house like moths to a very loud, very chaotic flame. Miller took one look at the statue, at the cheering crowd, at the unconscious Carol being fanned by a frantic neighbor, and he just shook his head, a slow, weary smile spreading across his face. He looked at me, then at the 10-foot-tall concrete finger, and then back at me. "Son," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and exasperation. "You are a special kind of crazy. You know that, right?" He then tipped his hat, a gesture of respect from one artist to another, and drove away, leaving us to our celebration. The legal battle that followed was the stuff of local legend. It was an epic saga of suburban warfare, a courtroom drama for the ages. The HOA, with a now revived and vengeful Carol as their star witness, sued me for everything from property damage and bylaw violations to intentional infliction of emotional distress. They claimed my statue had created a hostile and aesthetically jarring living environment. I, in turn, countersued for harassment, reckless endangerment, for the whole padlock and flood incident, and the violation of my First Amendment right to express myself through the medium of giant, anatomically questionable concrete sculptures. My legal defense was a masterpiece of righteous indignation and carefully selected legal precedents, aided once again by a slick, compelling, and surprisingly moving PowerPoint presentation. The story went viral. It was picked up by local news, then national news, then, inexplicably, by a Japanese morning show. News crews camped out on my street. My monument, as it came to be known, became a local landmark, a pilgrimage site for disgruntled homeowners and lovers of absurdist art everywhere. People came from all over to take pictures with it, often mimicking its defiant gesture. I was a suburban folk hero, a champion of the little guy, a man who had dared to stand up to the tyranny of the HOA and tell them exactly where they could file their laminated notes. The case eventually ended up in front of Judge Mildred Hornsby, a cantankerous, no-nonsense woman in her late 70s who looked like she had been carved from a block of granite and had a reputation for eating lawyers for breakfast. She had clearly seen her fair share of ridiculous lawsuits, and she had zero patience for any of it. She listened to Carol's tearful, dramatic testimony about the psychological trauma the statue had inflicted upon her. She listened to the HOA's lawyer drone on and on about the sanctity of the neighborhood's aesthetic cohesion. And she listened to my calm, reasoned defense, occasionally nodding along to the key points of my PowerPoint. In the end, she threw out most of the HOA's case with a wave of her hand. She ruled that while my statue might be in poor taste, a point I was willing to concede, it didn't technically violate any bylaws. Pete's freestanding ornamental yard art loophole had held up, a glorious victory for legal loopholes everywhere. "This is a case about a fence, a flood, and a finger," she declared, her voice booming through the courtroom. And frankly, it's the most interesting thing to happen in that God-forsakenly beige neighborhood in 50 years. She did, however, have one condition. She ordered me to paint the statue a neutral, earth-toned color in the interest of promoting a modicum of community harmony. I complied, of course. I was a reasonable man, after all. I painted it a tasteful, HOA-approved beige, a color that blended in seamlessly with the bland, soulless landscape of my suburban prison. But in a final, subtle act of defiance, a quiet little wink to the rebellion that had started it all, I added one small, almost imperceptible detail. A single, defiantly bright, glossy red fingernail on the tip of the extended middle finger. The war was over. Carol, defeated and publicly humiliated, sold her house and moved to a remote, off-the-grid cabin in Montana, presumably to terrorize the local moose population with her laminated notes. The HOA's power was shattered, its authority broken. The neighborhood, free from the iron fist of Carol's reign, became a more chaotic, more colorful, and ultimately more interesting place to live. And I, Leo, the man who had flooded his basement to save it, was elected by unanimous decision as the new, unofficial president for life of the newly reformed and much more relaxed Homeowners Association. My first act as president was to abolish all bylaws pertaining to lawn gnomes. 1 year later, I'm sitting in my now flood-proof basement. It's been upgraded, of course. The home theater now boasts a 4K laser projector and a sound system that can replicate the sonic boom of a fighter jet with terrifying accuracy. The vintage arcade machines have been fully restored, their cheerful 8-bit theme songs a constant, reassuring presence. And in the corner, on permanent standby, sits the portable Substation fleet, a silent guardian, a watchful protector, a dark knight against any future acts of HOA-sanctioned sabotage. I look out the small basement window, up at my statue. The beige monolith, a monument to one man's refusal to let his basement or his spirit be dampened. The afternoon sun glints off its single, defiant red fingernail, a tiny spark of rebellion in a sea of conformity. I raise my own middle finger in a silent, heartfelt salute. It's amazing, really, how a little thing like a flooded basement can change your life, how a petty argument over a sump pump can escalate into a full-blown suburban war, a legal battle, and a minor international incident. But if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Sometimes you have to fight for your right to have a dry, well-lit, and fully functional man cave, free from the tyranny of petty despots and their laminated decrees. And sometimes, just sometimes, the only way to fight a Karen is to become a bigger, smarter, more creative, and infinitely more technically advanced Karen yourself. You just have to be willing to generate a little noise,